last session of this conference, and it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Emily Ryall. So I've heard some words about Emily. So before you begin, let me just say a few words. Emily is currently holding an academic position at the University of Gloucestershire, and I think that it's no exaggeration to say that she's a world-renowned philosopher, especially on issues related to games, sports, and play. So we are really, really lucky to have her here. She's the author of the books Philosophy of Sport E-Questions, published in 2016. Also, the author of the book Critical Thinking for Sport Students, published in 2010. Moreover, she's the author or co-author of a series of books on the philosophy of play. Also, associate editor for the journal Philosophy of Sport. She has published numerous articles in the philosophy of sport area. Most recently, she received Heather's Distinguished Service Award for her dedicated work in the philosophy of sport area and for her services for the IAPS. I've been honored to spend some time with Emily in 2019 at the University of Gloucester, and also to cooperate with her over the past years. And I have to say, Emily, it was a privilege to work with you, really. And I was looking for some interesting facts about Emily, things that you might not know. So hopefully I found some. So well, those are the ones that you told me. So in terms of watching sport, Emily is more a purist than the partisan. Did you know that? And besides sport, this hopefully will be an interesting fact. She's a cat lover, really. That's really nice. And today she will speak about sportsmanship as agential layering, or sportsmanship as agential shifting. Emily, thank you very much again for being here, and the floor is yours.
I mean, to be honest, the honour is mine, and I realise what a great privilege it is to be asked to deliver a keynote, and it's quite nerve-wracking as well, because I feel like I have to say something important and interesting and engaging, and I don't know whether I'm able to do all of that, but I really appreciate the honour of being asked to come here to this conference. I think I'd like to echo Jim's words at the beginning of the conference in relation to Lucas's work ethic and organisation and kindness, I think, as well. Honestly, he's so kind in terms of making sure that I'm okay, that I know where I'm going, and I know that he does the same for everybody. I'd like to think that Lucas is a good friend as well, and I really enjoyed the time that he spent at Gloucestershire, and hopefully we'll get further opportunities. But and also to Daniel as well for hosting the conference here. And please give Lucas a week off at least afterwards, because I know he's put so much effort into organising such a wonderful event with amazing people like yourselves here. Okay, so let's move on to what I've got to say. I know that everyone's tums are probably rumbling and you're thinking, well, can I get some lunch? But please bear with me. As I say, hopefully it will be some interesting ideas, even if I haven't necessarily got all the solutions to the questions that I'm going to pose. I also realise that the title I've put up here is slightly different to the one that I gave in my abstract and listed in the programme. So, when you get asked to think about what you're going to present, and you think, okay, well, I can present on that, and then as you think about it, you think, actually, it doesn't really make sense, or it needs a little bit of changing. So I hope that in my presentation I'll explain the shift, to excuse the pun. What I'm going to try and do in this talk is build upon some work that I started in response to Nguyen's ideas about agency and game playing. So I'm going to provide a bit of a background and contextualisation into to his work, particularly around agency, and then I'm going to focus on the concept of agential layering and what this means, and then I'm going to argue that sportsmanship as a moral concept might be able to be understood through this notion of agential layering. So in this, I will try and argue that sportsmanship can be understood as the ability to shift between agential layers. So a year or so ago, I was asked to contribute to a special issue of the Journal of the Philosophy of Sport and provide a response to T. Nguyen's book, Games, Agency as Art. If you're not familiar with it, it's made a significant impression in the philosophical kind of world, in a number of areas, from sport to games to aesthetics to technology. It's really made quite a lot of waves, and it's won a number of philosophical prizes. What Nguyen essentially does is he makes the argument that games are an art form, and they use the medium of agency. So whereas sculptures may use the medium of marble or wood or stone, and writers use the medium of the written language in order to express their art, Nguyen argues that game players use the medium of games as an expression of their agency. So, to quote the screen, he says, "Games are a method for inscribing forms of agency into artifactual vessels, for recording them, preserving them, and passing them around. And we possess a special ability. We can submerge ourselves in alternate agencies designed by another. In other words, we can use games to communicate forms of agency." So in my response to his book, I focused on his concept of agential layering. And this is an ontological concept because it's about the question of being and how to conceptualise it and understand it. What Nguyen means by agency, I think, is our capacity to act in order to attain a motivational goal. And he says, to quote, "That distinctive gaming experience is accessible by players only if they give themselves to the goal of the game, only if they try, with some degree of commitment, to win. This, I will argue, requires that we submerge ourselves in these alternate in-game agencies, that we take on these temporary ends as something like final ends. We have to induce in ourselves some sort of gripping interest in achieving the goals of the game in order to access the particular experiences on offer. The fact that we can achieve this kind of absorption during gameplay reveals something rather astonishing about us. Our agency turns out to be significantly more fluid and modular than we might have thought. Games highlight our ability to substantially, voluntarily and quickly manipulate aspects of our own agency." End quote. So most of you will be aware of the philosophy of Bernard Suits, author of the seminal text, The Grasshopper, Games, Life and Utopia. So Suits articulated the goals of games inherently require inefficient ways to reach that goal, and the illusory attitude is our conscious acceptance of this inefficiency. When we play a game, we know that there are more efficient ways of reaching our goal, but we act as if there are not. The illusory attitude requires that we, in essence, deceive ourselves as to how our goal can be achieved. So if we take football as an example, the illusory goal I'm trying to achieve is to get the ball into the net. But I make this more difficult than it needs to be by accepting the rules that predominantly I should use my feet. For it to be a good game, I, along with the other players involved, we should strive our utmost to achieve that illusory goal. And if I don't strive, or I don't try my utmost to achieve this end, it's not likely to be a good game. And we often use the term things like spoil sport when people aren't trying enough or they're not engaged. So good games require us, as Nguyen states, to act as if the temporary ends of the game are final ends. At the end of the game, I should be exhausted, my muscles should be aching from all this striving. So the question is, how can I put everything into achieving the illusory goal, while at the same time knowing that I'm doing so inefficiently? How can I act as if my temporary ends are final ends? So Nguyen's answer to this is agential layering. We have multiple layers of agency so that we can move between different ends. So to quote, the inner agent tries to win. The outer agent has no reason to help the inner agent and may manipulate their overall ability to win in order to get the right degree of struggle. We have then the capacity to submerge ourselves in a temporary agency and thereby create layers of motivational states. In striving play, the inner layer involves taking on motivations to succeed in the game's terms, to win, and to win by achieving whatever the game specifies as the goals. The outer layer involves those motivations which brought us to play the game in the first place, and interest in aesthetics, fun, fitness, or whatever. These motivations of the inner layer are justified by the motivations of the outer layer, but that justification isn't phenomenally active during the game. We do not hold both layers in the forefront of our consciousness. We hide our larger reasons from ourselves for a time, submerging ourselves in the inner layer. So if Nguyen is correct, what I am interested in is the kind of philosophical understanding behind our ability to shift between layers of agency. So I'm also interested in what it can add to an axiological understanding in terms of what agential layers can say about what we value and what we prioritise. So I'm going to try and address these two questions. How can the notion of agential layers be conceptualised, and whether it makes sense as a concept at all? We might decide it doesn't make sense as a concept. And then I'll move on to considering whether the notion of agential layers can provide any axiological and in particular ethical understanding. So if we take the first point on the mechanism of agential shift, what does it mean to say that there are layers of agency that we shift from one to another? Now, the notion of different realities isn't new. In some respects, Nguyen's ideas build upon those suggested by Johan Huizinga in Homo Ludens, where he talks about that magical circle of reality formed by play. So play, for Huizinga, is an activity which proceeds within certain limits of time and space in a visible order according to rules freely accepted and outside the sphere of necessity or material utility. So Huizinga recognised that the world of play is different to the world outside play. And that's why I'm particularly struck by the ontological aspect of games. So it allows us to inhabit a different form of life and ultimately to be a different form of being. And this is true whether it's a logic puzzle game like Tetris, or a role-playing game like Grand Theft Auto or Red Dead Redemption 2. So that picture on the right-hand side is from a game called Red Dead Redemption 2. Oh my God, I've spent hours and hours and hours, days, weeks playing that. It's a form of being, in the terms of when we play football or throw the hammer, athletics or motor racing. Huizinga was criticised by Suits, among others, for suggesting that everything was play, and I think Scott referred to that the other day. And yet I think in some respects everything can be a game if our agency is constrained and we adopt the illusory attitude in our participation. So the concept of agential layers then is to inhabit different forms of agency, within some of which we adopt the illusory attitude and some of which we don't, and I'll kind of talk about that later. So I'll say at this point, I'm not entirely convinced by the notion of nested layers like an onion. So Nguyen, he quotes Stocker in this, and he kind of conceptualises layers like an onion, and you kind of peel away the layers. So Nguyen talks about outer and inner layers, but I think that the way that Nguyen talks about it is a little bit confusing, because normally when we talk about the core of something, we talk about the kind of the fundamental, and when we talk about the outside or the outer, we're talking about the peripheral. Whereas when you read Nguyen, he's kind of got it the other way round, which to me is a little bit confusing. I think it's worth bearing that in mind. So I'm tempted to use a different term. I'm tempted to talk about agential realities, but I haven't really had enough time to kind of think whether that concept works or whether it's better. It's also not the focus of this paper, so I'm kind of leaving it as agential layers at the moment, but I think maybe in the future it may be better to talk about agential realities. So the way that Nguyen sets out the notion of agential layers implies that there's a series of worlds or realities that we can move between. In a game, we find ourselves in one world or reality, but we kind of, in effect, flick a switch and move into another. And I think there's something to be said to this way of conceptualising it. So in my previous paper, I suggested that the empirical literature on this was fairly sparse. It doesn't really adequately explain what drives the shift in agency. So most of the literature that I ended up drawing upon was the kind of psychological literature about attention and what stimulus our attention is drawn to, and what drives kind of a shift or change in attention. But I'm not sure that the empirical literature on attention is necessarily the right literature. Agency is more than attention. It's knowing what our capacities are and what goal we're trying to reach. So, although to some extent the concept of agential layers is an empirical one, I don't think we've got the empirical answers about what's going on if it can be said that we shift our agency. There is, however, a well-cited paper by Bredemir, Shields and Horn, which considers the notion of violence in sports. And I think what's interesting about their study is that it seems to provide some empirical evidence to support the notion of agential layers. So, for instance, they cite an interview with NFL player Ron Rivera, who describes the two different persons he is on and off the pitch. So the off-field Ron says that he's soft-spoken, he's considerate, he's friendly. The on-field Ron is, to quote, the total opposite. And I think this chimes with my experiences of playing rugby with some individuals, and I know kind of I mentioned an incident I had 15 or so years ago, but also one of the players I often played with, I played on the same team as her for many years, was also, she was the most loveliest, kindest person off the pitch. On the pitch, she was just horrible. She was a really mean, nasty player. And I remember at the time thinking how odd it was that she almost embodied two different personalities. The irony of this player is that actually, in her day job, she was actually a police officer. So, or maybe that's not ironic. What Bredemir, Shields and Horn identify, I think, is the shifting between agential layers. So one layer in the game, the other layer outside. And in some ways, this perhaps isn't any different to that sociological concept that Erving Goffman was talking about when he identified the different ways in which we present the self in the various roles that we have in life. So I present a very different persona here when I'm talking to you to the one that I present with my family or when I'm playing with my niece and nephew. And equally the one that I present when I'm playing sports. So Goffman's theory suggests that the roles we play is a different constraint of agency. Now, I guess maybe when Goffman was talking about, he was talking about the kind of the constraint of agency that's driven by kind of cultural and social expectations about what that role entails. Are those roles games? I don't think they are. There's no losery attitude involved. But they're certainly constraints of agency, and in that sense, they're agential layers. But this still doesn't answer the question about what is going on when we shift our agency. If I was to hedge my bets on this, I think Nguyen and others are correct in suggesting that we can inhabit multiple worlds at the same time, but with varying levels of consciousness or awareness. That we are sub- or semi-consciously aware of the alternative worlds we can inhabit enables us to switch between these agential layers. In other words, even though I can be fully engrossed in a game, part of me would still be aware of events happening outside that game. This explains why I can stop playing. So in answer to my first question, I think that the notion of agential layers or agential realities makes philosophical sense, even if we don't know on an empirical level how it might work. However, as suggested by Bredemir, Shields and Horn's study, when they discuss violence in sports, agential shifts also indicate an ethical dimension. A shift of agencies requires more than awareness of different realities. It requires the prioritisation of values as to what is more or less important. So let me bring in one of Suit's examples to illustrate, so you might be aware of it. I don't know whether he was actually thinking of like Mario as in kind of Mario, the cartoon character. But anyway, so he talks about Mario, the dedicated racing driver. And if you know this example, so Mario is racing around the track in an attempt to achieve the fastest lap that he can. He is so dedicated to that illusory goal that when an errant child runs out in front of him, he just continues and he mows down the child. He doesn't do anything to avoid the child or to leave the track. So onlookers, spectators were horrified. Oh my goodness, what is Mario doing? Now this is my interpretation of, because Suits doesn't talk about this, my interpretation, he's interviewed post-race and the journalist says to him, what on earth were you thinking? And he said, well, his priority was that illusory goal of racing. He looked in the rule book, there's no rules against running down children on the track. So he carried on racing. Now we're horrified by Mario's actions. We're saying Mario just got his priorities wrong. Even to say that he got his priorities wrong seems absurd. It's self-given. In terms of agential layering, Mario should have exited that layer whereby his agency was directed to racing around the track. He should have entered the layer whereby his agency was directed towards avoiding injury to the child. And let me come to another more recent example. So hopefully you're I'm sure, this doesn't work, let's see if that works. Before I play this, I just want, so this is a montage from some BBC commentary about the event, but I just want you to look at people's body languages as to what's going on here.
It's going to be halted again, and this does look serious. Well, Christian Eriksen in some distress by the look of things. Well, the players knew straight away that was a heavy fall. Well, you can tell immediately, can't you, from players' body language. And this is a country with a social conscience, and they can see the bigger picture. That is hot off the press.
He very privately, of course, as quickly as possible, that became apparent to us that now we have to almost forget completely about football, as I said, just worry about.
Coverage will continue in a moment. Delay.
So, hopefully you're aware of that incident with Christian Eriksen, the Danish player in the Euros finals last year. I think what's particularly noticeable in this clip is how quickly the players from both teams switch from the illusory goals of the game to a genuine care for the welfare and well-being of Eriksen. I've got a slightly different version, which I think was recorded off the original TV footage. So I've slowed down this. I think I've slowed it down. So if you watch it, just watch what happens. So Eriksen goes down. And the first player to notice is actually a Finnish player. You can see immediately they stop the game, you know, no questions asked. And they're asking, he was okay, don't worry, I wouldn't have shown this if he died. He did recover, and he has returned to football as well, which is obviously good. Okay. So as I said, you know, first player to actually stop playing is actually a Finnish player. The players around him don't carry on just as if he was an obstacle to be avoided. They immediately change their ends. So the temporary ends of the game of football cease, and the players' new ends are focused on the well-being of Eriksson as a human being. So if we put this example in the language of agential layering, it's clear that the players and the spectators and officials, because again, if you look at the body language, switch almost immediately from the illusory goals of football to a wider agency of care for Eriksson. And contrary to the actions of Mario, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone that would argue, no, what the players did, you know, they should have carried on playing. And it was this example, you know, watching it that made me start to think about agential layering in respect to ethical concepts in sports, and notably sportsman or sportspersonship. So there's been many different conceptions of sportsmanship in the literature, ranging from Gough's arguably vague conception of being good and doing right in sport, to Vazel's play spirit, to Butcher and Schneider's respect for the game, to Sessions' personal honour, to Abad's balance of fairness, equity, good form and the will to win. At the very least, I think it's reasonable to argue with Keating's seminal paper, way back in 1964, that sportsmanship is a moral category. Sportsmanship says something about how sport ought to be played and our obligations and duties as players. The most recent, I think, conceptualisation of sportsmanship can be found in Hemmingson's paper in the Journal of Philosophy of Sport, entitled Carl Schmitt, Sportsmanship and the Lus Publicum Ludus. In it, Hemmingson argues that the value of sport and the conception of sportsmanship is in the way that it transforms opponents from inimicus, or as foes to be destroyed, into hostis, as enemies to be defeated. So some of this analysis might be treated as an exercise in semantics, and I think in particular the terms foe and, I mean, he's quite particular in whether he says foe or enemy, but I think in English foe and enemy are fairly synonymous. But I think Hemmingson's recent account might help to illuminate some of Nguyen's notion of agential layering. So Hemmingson notes, players are asked to adopt two seemingly conflicting attitudes. On the one hand, they have to give their all. On the other, they have to restrain themselves in the means to defeat their opponents. So this reflects Nguyen's agential layers. To play a game is to recognise the agential constraints one is working with, but at the same time to be able to shift outside these constraints to know that they are freely chosen. What I think is particularly interesting about Hemmingson's analysis is the way that he draws upon Carl Schmitt, Nicholas Holmes' political philosophy in distinguishing between hostis and inimicus. There's an ethical difference, Schmitt and Holm argue, between seeing someone as a political opponent to be beaten and seeing them as an evil enemy to be expunged. It's a trigger warning. It's British politics now, so. Such an account indicates, you know, there was an incident a few weeks ago on a television programme in the UK whereby the Scottish First Minister, so Nicola Sturgeon, she said, she was asked a question about which would be worse, a Labour government or a Conservative or Tory government, and she effectively said a Labour government, and then she went on to say, I detest the Tories. Now, there was a UK Tory Conservative minister on the same television programme, and he was really offended. He said this is really dangerous language to say that you detest a political party. Incidentally, a couple of years ago, a different politician, a Labour politician, Emily Thornberry, ended up having to apologise to the Scottish National MPs because she said she hated their party. The same Nicola Sturgeon responded, she said, hate is not a good emotion in politics. Now, I'm not going to say too much more about UK politics because it's a joke, to be honest, at the moment. But in politics, as in sport, I think there's a difference in seeing our opponents as individuals with similar aims and personhood who can be fairly beaten, and seeing them as non-persons to be hated and destroyed. In Western democracies, our political systems, hopefully, are built on the healthy challenge of ideas, not on the annihilation of our opponents. And that explains how cross-party coalitions can form, and how some very unlikely friendships between political adversaries are developed. So such a view resonates with Simon's concept of sport as a mutual quest for excellence. So a good game requires us to hold the illusory attitude and recognise each other as equals and indispensable opponents. Without those two elements, the game dematerialises ceases to exist. So I think Hemingson's concept of sportsmanship is ultimately based on the notion of respect. It's about how we see each other. Similarly, if we look at other definitions of sportsmanship outside the philosophy of sport literature, the notion of respect is central. So there's a quote here by Joyner and Mummery that it's based on another definition by Vallerand et al. So they argue sportspersonship is thought to be comprised of 5 dimensions, and the italics is mine. Respect for social conventions of sport, respect for the rules and officials, respect for one's full commitment to participation, respect and concern for the opponent, and the absence of a negative approach to sport. And I think it's worth focusing on this concept of respect in more detail. Now, most of you have probably realised the rule to present at this conference is that you must mention some work by Jim Parry. That goes without saying. I'm not just buttering Jim up here when I say one of my favourite texts actually is this book. Hopefully you're aware of it. It's kind of we were talking 24 years ago, I think now. So getting on a bit, but actually, you know, it's a very good philosophical collection of works, and most chapters, I believe, have stood this test of time. It's got some excellent articles in it. One of them is the Tuxton and Wigmore's chapter, Merely Meet, Respect for Persons in Sport and Games. So Tuxton and Wigmore analyse the concept of respect in their consideration of how we ought to treat others in sports. And they draw upon Darwell's distinction between recognition and appraisal respect. Now, my understanding of this distinction is that the former, so recognition respect, is concerned with what we determine an object is, whereas the latter is a more personal, subjective valuing of something. So I'm going to focus next part of my discussion on the former, so the recognition respect, because I think it's a bit more, it's more fundamental and arguably a bit more objective. So what can be called moral recognition respect is that there are correct and incorrect ways of seeing or recognising things in the world, which leads us to a moral imperative as to how they should be treated. So respect is rule governed in that the way that we treat someone or something is dependent on our beliefs about what type of thing or being it is. So this means that we can behave very differently towards different things in the world and still treat them with due respect. So I'm treating a football with due respect by kicking it. I would not be treating a small dog with due respect by kicking it. So my beliefs about the type of thing that a football and a dog is determines what is appropriate action towards them. So I think moral recognition and respect is a useful concept because it recognises the value of things in the way that we conceive and understand them in a rational, objective way. And this is what enabled Kant to formulate his second categorical imperative in terms of always treating others as an end and never merely as a means to an end. Recognising others as humans who have hopes, dreams, fears, ambitions, needs, etc. impels us to treat them with this in mind. To see our opponent and in sport as someone who has the same illusory goals that we do, but equally to see them as humans that will feel pain when they twist their ankle or joy when they score a goal, is to treat them with due respect. So in terms of agential layering, this means that despite being a player in a game, let's say the game of football for example, whereby we see our opponents as barriers to bringing about our illusory goal, we also recognise them as persons. Whilst in a game we inhabit the agential layers which sees them as an opponent to be beaten, but despite this we still recognise them as persons that deserve to be treated with due respect, or in Hemingson's language, as hostis rather than inimicus. Hemingson's distinction seems to imply that there's an appropriate time to treat another as inimicus, as an enemy to be destroyed. And I was trying to imagine a situation whereby this would be the case. I'm not sure that it would be when we're dealing with real human beings, but perhaps an analogy where the notion of inimicus is appropriate is this, as if I was playing a video game. So let's imagine that scenario of Ericsson's collapse was actually a video game. It was just a simulation. So in that sense, it would be appropriate for me to carry on playing. So similarly, if I was playing Mario Kart, I was playing as Mario on Mario Kart, and there was somebody who kind of hacked the game and a child kind of ran across the track, it wouldn't be immoral of me to just run down over the child and carry on racing. You might say it was a bit of a kind of sick game because, you know, it's depicting the death of a child, but it wouldn't be immoral in the sense that it's not violating the moral recognition respect criterion. So in terms of agential layering, it says something about the way that we can hold moral recognition respect within agential layers. There is something to be said for the way that we view others inside and outside a game. When playing against others in a game of football, we treat them as obstacles in the achievement of our goal, but we do not violate the concept of moral recognition respect. We know that they're still humans that deserve to be treated in a particular way. It means that we're able to therefore switch agential layers when the game breaks down, or as in the case of the Denmark-Finland game, when we recognise that our opponent has ceased to be opposition, because in the case of Ericsson, he collapses. Sportsmanship, I will argue, demonstrates that agential shift. So I'm going to draw to a close by considering kind of 3 examples in my analysis. So the first is the trash talking between fighters preparing for a bout. So you're all familiar with this, you know, they tell each other how they're going to absolutely be crushed and annihilated, they're not worthy to fight them. But I argue that that kind of trash talking is often considered part of the performance. And actually, you know, those players will still treat each other with that moral recognition, respect. That trash talking can just be considered another agential layer in itself. It's to play the role of archenemy and foe. The second example is the MMA fighter that continues to hit his opponent even though he's lying unconscious on the mat in a pool of blood. So, you know, just imagine a fight is happening and the MMA fighter is just absolutely annihilating. You know, he's unconscious, he can't defend himself. The referee's trying to break it up, but he's carrying on punching him. Now, how can that make sense through this notion of agential layering? Now, one interpretation could be that that fighter has just got stuck in that game world reality, in the same way that Mario was stuck in his racing reality.
The fighter, we might argue, should have shifted agencies to one that sees his opponent as a defeated foe. But he's not able to demonstrate that appropriate shift in agential layers. Alternatively, it may be that an agential shift has occurred, but it's an immoral one. You know, the fighter knows that that player is unconscious, knows that the game is over, it's stopped, but it equally is not demonstrating that moral recognition, respect for his opponent. The fighter no longer inhabits the game world of MMA fighting, but a darker one where he has an agency to harm, if not kill, his opponent. And the final one is one that can be demonstrated in this following clip. Hopefully that will work. Excuse me, I should have just set it. That, to me, appears that a double agential shift has taken place. So the player sees his teammate lying on the ground, apparently injured, so he shifts the agency whereby he signals to his opponents that the game needs to be stopped. You know, we've got a player injured. His opponent's agency then shifts to outside the game and one of concern to that injured player. And that's when the original player then shifts back to the agency of game playing and continues to play. So in that sense, the original player, that player that kind of tries to stop the game and then restarts it, is playing two games, one of football and one arguably of gamesmanship. And I think I'm probably happy to conclude that gamesmanship too is a shift in agencies. Perhaps it's a more morally problematic one. So gamesmanship requires the ability to inhabit and shift between different agential layers, one that's within the sport, one that's outside it. And gamesmanship is often placed on the same scale as sportsmanship. It's seen as, at worst, bad sportsmanship, at best, a slightly kind of devious, if not immoral way of playing a game. Gamesmanship is to play a different game, beyond the one that your opponent is playing, and the one that officials believe should be playing, even if they don't have the necessary means to eject the player from that game. So often gamesmanship, the officials don't really know what to do, because it's a kind of game, but it's not the game that they think should be played. As we saw in that clip, it nevertheless involves the ability to switch between layers in the way that sportsmanship requires. I think one question I haven't considered, and I haven't certainly had that time to consider, is whether there's a true agential reality, or whether you can say that there's an authentic layer of agency. I think that's a hugely complex question, and I don't think I've got an answer to it. In some respects, it appears that when we're not playing games or sports, that is our true agency. But in other respects, the very act of playing games or sports gives us a different form of agency, which is equally authentic. Now, I've experienced times when I've been totally absorbed in the game. And as my earlier example of the MMA fighter that continues to pound his opponent into the ground despite the fact that they're unconscious, illustrates this fighter, you might say, was stuck in one agential reality. And I think it was mentioned earlier, as Neo discovered in the Matrix, what we think is our authentic agential reality may not end up being the case. So, in conclusion, let's go back. So in conclusion, what I'm proposing is a furthering of our understanding of Nguyen's agential layers. So in terms of what they are and how they can explain what's going on in sporting competition. Now, I'm sure I haven't untangled the complexities around agential layers and what is going on when we move between different forms of agency. But what I've tried to do is argue that sportsmanship is the ability to switch between layers of agency or to move between different realities at the same time, but also to be cognizant of what these different realities represent and how they fit in an axiological framework. It is to recognise that some things are more or less important in the moment. So I guess my conclusion is good sportsmanship is to move between agential layers appropriately, and bad sportsmanship or gamesmanship is to do so inappropriately. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. Very good. Okay, now we have some room for discussion. So I think, Jim, you are first. And then, okay.
Hi, Emily. Great paper. The question is, sometimes you are speaking as if I can only inhabit layers consecutively. So, you know, the question is, cheers. Thanks, sir. The question is, how do layers manifest themselves, or how do I inhabit these layers? And so the language of shift and switch makes it seem like it's only consecutive. You know, only one at a time. I'm in here, then I'm in there, right? Or is it possible for us to entertain more than one layer at a time? Because if it's consecutive, it seems to suggest that all agency has to be layer dependent. You know, you have to be in some one layer at a time before you switch to the next one.
Yeah, I haven't got an answer to that, and this is exactly the issue I'm trying to wrestle with. I think perhaps some of it is the fact that I guess in our experiences of things, and this is why I ended up being drawn to that psychological literature about attention, because our attention is kind of focused on one thing at any one time. Nguyen talks about agential layers, and he talks about it as if it's agential nesting. I think he uses the word, as if it's a kind of nest of inner and outer layers. And I'm not sure whether that is an appropriate conceptualization. And I'm trying to think, is there a better metaphor that we can use? And I don't have an answer to that. That's what I'm really trying to wrestle with, whether there's a better metaphor that helps us conceptualize what our agency and our focus and our attention is on at any one time, and can we have focus at the same time but at different emphasis or different weights? I don't know. I know that's not helpful.
Can I give you an example?
Please.
The example I always have in my mind is boxing. I've developed arguments to suggest that boxing is immoral, but I love it. And I'm thinking of a fight that's 100%, all the rounds, close, they're slugging each other to death, 10 rounds, and at the end, and you think they're trying to kill each other, right? And right at the end, when bing ding dong the bell goes, they're both exhausted, they fall into each other's arms, and their mates not quick. And I'm thinking, is that just a quick agent, a quick shift of layer? Or is it like all along I'm perceiving the other as my friend, my comrade in boxing, because only brave people do boxing at all, right? So they respect each other for doing that. Is that all along with trying to kill him?
Seems like more like an ingredient than maybe an layer.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. That was a brilliant presentation. He mentioned my favourite sociologist, and he might be able to help, Goffman. And he talks about it being a front stage and a backstage. And the front stage is this kind of formal performance. The shit talking, that's like a front stage. And then backstage, like Jim was saying, is they're mates. They get on. It's this informal bit that we don't see. As the audience, we're not privy to that. And so maybe this shifting is from the front stage to the backstage. And when Ericsson goes down, we see the backstage, we see the players as they really are, rather than the front stage performance. So I was wondering if that might be a useful way of you looking at it.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful conceptualisation, because it helps us, certainly helps me understand, you know, if somebody can act as if they're dying on stage and the play continues. If they do die on stage, everybody's rushing on to try and say, well, this isn't in the script as such. I think that's a useful conceptualisation. I don't necessarily think it gets over that question about, well, what's the kind of the true reality, if that makes sense. But yeah, thank you. That's helpful.
Okay, next is Jacob.
Well, yeah, I'm out of my depth here, but...
So am I.
Yeah, instead of thinking of Goffman, though, on this exact topic, I was thinking more of Heidegger and the distinction between ontic and ontological. The ontic is always still dependent on the ontological, and you can discuss some sort of ontological necessity of sport, and then the ontic is sometimes just reflecting and coming out on that. I don't know, I can't explain that properly yet still, sorry, Irena.
I can't say anything in relation to that, but I've written it down. I don't know if Irena wants to pick up on that as a I will look in to see whether that is a way of kind of conceptualising, but yeah.
Thank you. Next is Mattia, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily, for this presentation. It's really engaging. My mind is working like 100% right now, and thinking about it. And the first thing that comes to my mind, that if you need a conception, you need to definitely distinguish different layers and name them. You've done a brilliant job with this ethical side, I would say. But I think also that it should be taken into account Nguyen's division on a different kind of players or different kind of game playing, striving and achievement playing. So I think this could bring another level to this shift between levels of agency. So just a thought.
Yeah. I will. So Nguyen obviously, well, he wants to make the argument that the kind of good game players are those striving players that appreciate the process of playing rather than just reaching the goal, the end kind of goal, that achievement player, and that's effectively what most of his books are about. And I would agree with him. And I think that if we kind of value games and sports, it's not the end goal that is actually really important. It's the kind of the striving towards the end goal that's important. How does that fit into my kind of notion of agential layers? I'm not sure it does at the moment, but I will certainly carry on thinking about that. In relation to your first point about whether it's helpful to kind of label different layers, again, I think it's something to think about. Sorry, I spend so much time thinking about this. It takes me ages to try and digest the thoughts. I don't want to give, and it's probably a bit of a cop-up, but I don't want to give quick answers, flippant answers to questions, because then when I think about it later, I think, what an idiot, why did I say that? So.
Next is Irena, please.
Yeah, I'd like to add to what Jim said, because it seems to me quite important, and I think one example of this, that we may act on two levels at the same time, would be this distinction when we say that we win at all costs, or just like win, I don't know how we say it, not at all costs, and it's like when you win not at all costs, you kind of keep together that it's a person you don't want to injure. levels, but kind of holding them together
Yeah.
is important.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's why I brought politics into the mix, because to say, well, politics obviously isn't a game, as it's not a game, it's deadly serious. But at the same time, I think the right way to conduct politics is as if it is a game. So we do want to beat our adversaries in winning elections, but at the same time, once the election's called, we should then congratulate our opponent, or appreciate the game we've played in running for election or winning that political argument. And I know that's not how many politicians kind of, I guess, view themselves, but it is how many politicians do view it, and they do have, as I say, unlikely friendships do get formed in politics between different ends of the political spectrum in the same way that the sport do, because we just have, in the moment of debating or playing sport, we have one kind of goal we're trying to reach, and then outside of that we kind of recognise the kind of importance of those people as individuals. So.
Yeah, I think it's a good example, in that, like politicians to play the game of trying to win, but at the same time to think about everybody else, like about the citizens. So you would like them also to keep it together, not just after to shake hands, but like you just don't want promises, you want like serious thinking about you, but you kind of understand that they have to play something so that they look good, so that people will them. Yeah, I think it's similar like in sport, the two players somehow. Maybe you could, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, but you could think that if you start putting the players together, if they are controversial, you kind of make yourself more steady human than when you just shift.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's the question, is it possible to inhabit, or can we conceptualise, maybe we've just gone completely off track thinking about agential layers. Maybe that's just a red herring, and actually we've got to conceptualise it or use a different metaphor whereby we're able to imagine different realities at the same time, or different forms of agency at the same time. I don't know. This is, as I say, I'm kind of still thinking about it.
Next is Kian, please.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. Actually, I'm wondering, do you think this kind of agency of layers, there is kind of different mindset or thinking that direct or guide our actions, or is actually kind of a state of personal ordinary that react to different situations? So I'm wondering, this kind of agency layers, do you think it's kind of thinking, or the whole state of the person?
So, okay, so do I understand you? Are you saying, is it a conscious, or is it just a kind of a corporeal kind of just being rather than thinking? Is that what you're? Yeah. I think you might be right. Maybe we're trying to, or maybe I am trying to kind of over-philosophize here, in the sense that it may, and I recognise it isn't necessarily a conscious kind of shift of agency, but it's just a shift of agency from one agential constraint to another agential constraint, and it could well be. And that is the question I'm trying to ask. Is it, to what sense is it conscious, subconscious, semi-conscious, absence of conscious, whatever?
I'm thinking it is like I think it can only be said like it can be different. If we say it's different layers, then it seems like it's kind of different thinking. And but if we say it's kind of all together, then the only way to make sense of it can be all together is the state of being. Then it can all together, and you just like then you react to certain
my response to that is, and I come back to, maybe so I'm a fan of metaphor. Metaphors allow us to think about things in a different way to try and kind of make sense of what we're trying to illuminate or discuss or conceptualise. Metaphors are only useful to a certain extent. They break down sometimes, and sometimes we say, actually, that metaphor, we've pushed it so far that it doesn't work anymore. And I wonder whether this is what's happening with agential layers, is we've pushed that metaphor, or I've tried to push it, and then it breaks down, and I think, actually, it would be better to use a different metaphor to try and understand this, rather than metaphor of layers, agential layers. And I think that's where I'm probably getting to. Is this metaphor sufficient to what we want to try and articulate?
Probably the last question, Jim.
Yeah, just to add a bit here, I think there's an extra complication because it's not just a particular situation. It's also what focus of attention. So I don't know if it was you or somebody else raised the issue of whether we're concentrating on a particular win, a particular victory, or we're concentrating on something wider. Well, the wider things could be stuff like the significance of the rivalry itself. So to take football again, take Man U and Liverpool, or take Rangers and Celtic. They've been playing together, 100 years, since 94, I guess 90 years, 110 years, 140 years for Rangers and Celtic. I don't know the stats, but I'll bet you it's about 1/3 Rangers, 1/3 Celtic, and 1/3 a draw. That's after 140 years, right? And what's the result? No, about the same. Right, so if you look at the whole thing, the whole situation, it's not about the individual contests and the individual wins and losses. There's something bigger going on, which is the significance of the rivalry itself. So it depends, what situation you're in or what your focus is, what level your focus is at. Gets complicated, doesn't it?
I wish I hadn't done this now. I wish I should have done something easy like trans athletes in sport.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this deserves a big applause, so thank you very much.